She did not enter history, sir. She stormed into it, veiled not in linen but in myth, not with armies nor treaties, but with a gaze that bent empires and a silence that made men forget their kingdoms. Before she was legend, she was a girl exiled from her own palace. Her father, trembling under Roman debt, had fled Alexandria with his favorite daughter by his side. And so Cleopatra's first taste of power was not possession, but loss. She grew up not on a throne, but in its shadow. Watching from afar, she learned the language of survival, the way a serpent learns to curl in silence before it strikes. When she returned, she was no longer a child. Egypt was split. Her brother, a puppet of courtiers, wore the crown. Cleopatra, dismissed, banished once more, wandered the deserts with nothing but the echo of her bloodline behind her. But some women do not kneel. They wait. And when the world forgets them, they prepare to remind it. In the heart of a dying empire, Caesar stood triumphant in Alexandria, surrounded by sand and suspicion. He had crossed the sea not for love, but for tribute. Rome's lifeblood now flowed through Egyptian grain. And yet, what entered his chamber that night was not a supplicant, but a myth unrolled from a carpet. A woman dusted in the gold of ancient gods. Eyes deeper than the Nile, voice soft as linen torn by time. She did not beg. She simply existed, and in doing so rewrote every script of diplomacy. It wasn't seduction. It was recognition. A queen in exile, a general growing old, two rulers standing on the edge of their own oblivion. Cleopatra didn't ask for Rome's help. She offered something rarer, a future both glorious and doomed. What did he see in her? Not just a lover, not even a queen. He saw a flame refusing to go out in a world built of ash. In her presence, Caesar did not feel like a conqueror. He felt like a man staring at the divine. And when Rome whispered of scandal, when senators spat her name like a curse, he remained still. Because men like Caesar are not undone by women. They are undone by what women awaken in them, the illusion of immortality. Cleopatra returned to her throne not through war, but through spectacle. Her enemies drowned in Roman blood, her brother vanished beneath palace walls, and her face, young, unreadable, emerged once more beneath the golden sun of Egypt. But the crown she now wore burned hotter than before, because power once tasted changes its host. She was no longer just a monarch. She was a symbol, a living question. Was she Egypt's last hope? Or its final curse? In the markets of Alexandria, they spoke of her as if she were divine, Isis reborn, wrapped in pearls, commanding ships as if born from the sea itself. But in the quiet of her chambers, Cleopatra sat alone, surrounded by scrolls, maps, and the weight of 1,000 years of dynasties, all now balanced on her breath. She knew the truth, that the gods no longer ruled from Olympus or Heliopolis, that the age of myth was ending, and that Rome, hungry, cold, and merciless, was coming not just for her kingdom, but for her story. So she wrote faster. She negotiated harder. She bled slower. A woman born into a fading empire, crowned in exile, raised by desert winds, now dared to love a man who saw her not as land to be taken, but as legend to be preserved. And for a moment the world paused, because in the endless march of empires someone had placed a queen at the center of the storm, and she was not running. She was choosing. The child of the Nile had become the echo of the world. Her name traveled farther than her ships. In Rome, the Senate rooms grew cold at its mention. Cleopatra. Not a queen. A fever. A storm cloaked in silk. They called her a temptress, a sorceress, a disease corrupting the bones of the Republic. But beneath the venom there was fear. Because Rome, built on law, steel, and the illusion of control, had no answer for a woman like her. And yet Cleopatra did not speak of a war. She bore Caesar a son. His name was Caesarion, Little Caesar. And in that name was both ambition and treason. She imagined a world ruled not from Rome, not from Alexandria, but from their union, east and west, sun and sword, womb and will. But empires do not mix. They consume. Caesar never named the boy his heir. He couldn't, not with daggers circling his back like shadows waiting for dusk, but still, he protected them. And still, she waited. When he returned to Rome, she followed, not as a wife, but as a ghost in silk, housed just outside the city walls, forbidden by law to cross the sacred line into the heart of the Republic. Rome could worship its goddesses, but not let one walk its streets. The people stared, some with wonder, most with hatred, a woman who wore crowns like jewelry, who bathed in milk and read philosophy, who spoke 9 languages and walked barefoot among slaves. They had never seen such contradiction wrapped in flesh. When Caesar was murdered, not by enemies but by his own, the myth shattered. 23 knives, and yet not a single one aimed at her. Still she felt each blade, not in flesh but in future. The vision she had dared to believe in, unity, legacy, a son who could rule both marble and sand, died on the Senate floor. She fled, not out of fear but out of clarity, because Cleopatra knew what came next. Rome did not mourn, Rome fed, and power once spilled is drunk like wine. In Egypt she rebuilt again, and again. The goddess in the temple, the widow in the shadows. She held her son and told him stories of a father who bent history, who once held the world in his hands and lost it to a whisper. But the world was not done with her, because power never forgets beauty, and Rome never forgets unfinished business. Mark Antony, the soldier with the lion's jaw and the heart of a boy who believed in heroes. He was no Caesar, but he bled for the same gods. And in the aftermath of Caesar's fall, as Rome tore itself apart, Antony was sent to tame the East, and the queen who ruled it. What began as politics ended in something far more dangerous. He summoned her, and she answered not with ships, but with legend, sailing up the Cydnus River dressed as Aphrodite herself, gold dust on her skin, incense trailing in the air like a second breath. The crowd did not cheer. It fell silent, because what approached was not a ruler. It was a dream, long forgotten and suddenly real. He fell, instantly, utterly, not for her beauty, but for what her beauty symbolized. A world before Rome, a world where gods walked with mortals and fate was written in the stars. But Cleopatra did not fall. She measured, she weighed, she watched, and when she gave herself it was not as a gift, but as an empire in flesh. Together they were thunder. Their love was not tender. It was theatrical, explosive. They drank, danced, made kingdoms feel like bedrooms and vice versa. But beneath the laughter, Cleopatra worked. She secured territories, built alliances, raised armies, not for him, for Egypt, for Caesarion, for a vision that refused to die. In Rome they screamed, whore, witch, enemy. They could not believe it, that a Roman general had fallen not in battle but in bed, that his will bent not to the Senate, but to her. They feared what their eyes could not understand, a woman who wielded sex like a scepter, who governed through seduction, not because she lacked power, but because she knew it was the most dangerous form of it. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, watched all of this from the shadows of Rome, cold, calculating, a boy who had grown up under the weight of legacy, who had never ruled but had always wanted to. To him, Cleopatra was not a woman. She was the final obstacle, the last goddess standing in the way of empire. So he painted her as poison, sent letters, spread lies, turned Antony from general to traitor with nothing but ink. And in the streets of Rome the people howled, because nothing unites the masses like a common enemy, and nothing is easier to hate than a woman who refuses to be less. Cleopatra knew war was coming, but it was not a war of soldiers. It was a war of myths, and she had spent her life mastering the art of appearances. So she prepared. Ships, gold, alliances. But no matter how many sails she raised, no matter how many coins she melted, she could feel it. The shift, the slow drowning of old gods beneath the weight of a new world, a world that no longer believed in queens. She looked at Antony, saw in his eyes not strategy but sorrow. He still loved her, but love is not a kingdom, and passion is no match for propaganda. They were no longer rulers. They were relics, holding hands as the tide rose, pretending it was still the Nile and not history coming to swallow them whole. And yet Cleopatra smiled, because she understood something Antony never could. That to rule was not enough. To survive was not enough. She would not become a trophy. She would not be paraded. She would not be remembered as Rome's conquest. No. She would write the ending herself, even if it meant writing it in blood. By now, the gods had grown quiet. The temples still burned their incense, and the priests still spoke of divine favor, but Cleopatra knew the silence of Olympus was not absence. It was judgment. And the judgment had begun. War had come to her not as thunder, but as erosion. Not in sudden blows, but in steady betrayal. Grain by grain she watched her power slip through her fingers like desert wind. The Battle of Actium was not a battle. It was a reckoning. Off the coast of Greece, her fleet and Antony's stood in elegant formation, sails gleaming in the sun. But even beauty can rot. Rome's navy, disciplined, ruthless, silent, approached like a judgment long delayed. And in that moment, with the fate of empires hanging between horizon and sea, the gods revealed their cruelty. Antony's men began to falter. His captains questioned. The chain of command broke. And in the middle of it all, Cleopatra's ship turned. She fled, not from cowardice, but from calculation. Her navy was burning, her alliances crumbling, and beside her stood a man who had once conquered nations, and now could barely command himself. Antony followed. Of course he did. Not because it was strategic, but because he had long since stopped choosing Rome. He had chosen her, again and again, and in doing so, had lost everything else. Back in Alexandria, the lovers became prisoners of their own myth. The world they had tried to build, half Egyptian gold, half Roman fire, was now ash drifting over the palace walls. Octavian was coming, slowly, coldly, not to negotiate but to collect. Antony could not bear it. Not the defeat, nor the shame, and least of all the look in Cleopatra's eyes, still regal, still calculating, still unwilling to crumble. In a moment of despair, fed lies that she had already taken her own life, Antony fell on his own sword. The blade pierced but did not kill. Instead he bled slowly, painfully, calling her name, dragging himself through the palace corridors like a ghost not yet allowed to leave the living world. They brought him to her, dying, broken. In her arms the last general of Rome whispered words not of glory but of apology. Cleopatra did not cry. She did not rage. She held him gently like a priestess laying the final offering at a temple long abandoned. But her mind was elsewhere, because the end had not yet come. And she would not let it come for her like it came for him, uninvited, premature, grotesque. If death was to arrive, she would greet it in full regalia. Octavian entered Alexandria not as a conqueror, but as a mortician. The city had already surrendered. The armies had laid down their swords. The people, worn by hunger and fear, welcomed the new god in marble and armor. And Cleopatra, last of the pharaohs, queen of sun and sand, waited behind the thick stone of her mausoleum, where she had begun to prepare her exit. She tried once more. One final attempt, she met with Octavian, not as a supplicant, but as a mirror. She offered him alliances, wealth, even her crown. She spoke to him not as woman to man, but as ruler to ruler. He did not hear her. He did not need to. Her power was already a relic, her words an echo. She saw it in his eyes, not hatred, not even lust, just calculation. Octavian didn't want her alive. He wanted her humiliated, paraded through Rome in chains, a living trophy bound in golden shackles, dragged behind his triumphal chariot so the mob could spit at the woman who had dared to seduce their heroes. This Cleopatra could not allow. She returned to her chamber, called her most loyal servants. She dressed in her finest robes, not white of mourning, but the gold of rebirth. She surrounded herself with the relics of her gods, statues of Isis and Hathor, scrolls that whispered of eternity, vials of precious oil, coiled snakes carved in lapis. The air was thick with sandalwood, the kind they used only for funerals. Her own. Beside her a basket, inside a fig. Beneath the fig something ancient, something silent. The ass was no executioner. It was a companion, a gatekeeper. It had served the pharaohs for centuries. A single bite, and the blood begins to whisper. The heart slows. The vision narrows to a tunnel of gold. The soul, they said, finds the Nile again. Some say she chose poison. Some say the serpent. Some say Octavian lied, that her death was his doing, not hers. But all of these stories miss the point, because Cleopatra's final act was not a mystery. It was a message. She had lived as a goddess, ruled as a woman, loved as a queen, and lost like a myth. But she would not die like a prisoner. Octavian found her too late. Her body lay still, dignified, lips curled in the faintest suggestion of amusement. Her maidens lay beside her, loyal even in expiration. No screams, no stains, just silence, heavy and deliberate. In that moment Octavian lost something. He had won the war, taken the kingdom, eliminated the threat. But what stared back at him from that stone chamber was a kind of victory he could never claim. Because Cleopatra had left the world on her terms, wrapped not in shame, but in eternity. Her son Caesarion did not live long after. Octavian saw to that. Rome had no room for bloodlines it could not control. And so, the last pharaoh's line ended not with ceremony, but with silence. But the myth did not end. It began, because Cleopatra did not die in that tomb. She transcended. Her name, once spoken in whispers, now echoed through history, not as victim, not as villain, as enigma. A queen who mastered appearance, wielded desire, and in the face of the most powerful empire the world had known, chose death rather than submission. She was not perfect, she was not pure, she was power incarnate, and power never dies, it only changes form. In paintings she became a seductress, in poems a martyr, in politics a cautionary tale, but in truth she was something rarer, something the world still struggles to name. A woman who refused to be defined by the men who claimed to conquer her. A woman who chose silence, and in doing so, made the world speak her name forever. The day Cleopatra died, the world did not pause. Rome moved on. Its senators adjusted their robes, its armies readied for new conquests, and its new emperor Octavian, soon to be Augustus, began the final transformation of the Republic into an empire. A singular rule forged in blood and silence. And yet, in the marble corridors of power there lingered something that would not quite leave. A shadow. A perfume. A question no sword could cut. What do you do with a ghost that refuses to vanish? They buried her without ceremony. No parade. No wailing priestesses. No chorus of harps rising over the Nile. Her tomb was sealed. Her name erased from monuments. Her lover's legacy dismantled brick by brick. But empires, for all their strength, have always misunderstood myth. You cannot kill a woman who died by choice. You cannot erase a symbol written in the blood of history. Cleopatra became larger after death than she had ever been in life. Not because Rome glorified her, but because it couldn't forget her. The more it tried to define her, the more she slipped through its fingers. Seductress, savior, sinner, sorceress. No word quite held. She had made herself too complex to reduce, too vivid to whitewash. And so the image fractured. The West painted her in Roman guilt. A dangerous foreign queen who led their greatest men astray. She became the cautionary tale whispered behind marble columns, the warning sewn into the fabric of state. Do not trust the foreign woman with a crown and a gaze. Do not believe that a queen could be clever, or strategic, or more than what her beauty offered. But in the East, among the dust-covered scrolls and broken statues, there remained another truth, a deeper one. A woman who had ruled a fragmented world, not by force, but by finesse. A ruler who could speak the language of scholars and soldiers alike, who had made herself divine not through temples but through action, who had played the greatest empire in history and almost won. And what was her crime? Not loving Caesar, not bearing his child, not uniting with Antony. Her true crime was existing on her own terms. History hates that. Rome had always been afraid of the feminine that could not be controlled. They cloaked their myths in violence. Lucretia's virtue honored through suicide, Dido's power ended by flame, Medea turned monstrous when she refused to be silent. Cleopatra joined their ranks. A woman made monstrous, not by what she did, but by what she refused to do. Apologize. Even Octavian, victor emperor, founder of an age, knew this. He did not speak her name often. He did not parade her image, because some victories once voiced reveal more of the victor than the vanquished. To speak of Cleopatra was to remind the world that once a woman nearly unseated Rome, not with war, but with presence. Still, the stories survived. They traveled through time like smoke, shifting in shape but never fading. In the Middle Ages she became sin incarnate, the dark eve of the Mediterranean. In the Renaissance she was rediscovered by painters who could not look away. In the Enlightenment she became the subject of philosophy, of theater, of debate, always returning, always reappearing, in marble, in oil, in verse. And yet, how little they understood her. They asked the wrong questions. Did she love Caesar? Was Antony her downfall? Did she really kill herself with a snake? As if love or death or rumor could contain her. As if she were a character, not a force. They obsessed over her beauty, her body, her bedroom, as if that were the throne she ruled from. But Cleopatra's true legacy was elsewhere. It was in the way she refused to become what they wanted. In the way she moved through a world built for men, not by copying them, but by bending the rules around her. She did not dress like Rome. She dressed like Isis. She did not speak Latin. She made them learn Greek. She did not campaign in armor. She negotiated with silks and silences. In a culture that worshipped brute force, she showed that power could wear perfume and still win. And it terrified them, because Cleopatra proved a truth too dangerous for empire, that to lead, one does not need to dominate. One needs to understand. And she understood everything, her people, her enemies, her moment in history. She ruled not with arrogance, but with awareness. She was not above manipulation, but she was also not beneath sacrifice. Every move she made was calculated, every alliance, every myth, every appearance. When she unrolled herself from that carpet before Caesar, She wasn't surrendering. She was declaring. When she welcomed Antony in the robes of Aphrodite, she wasn't seducing. She was reminding him of who held the script. And when she chose death, she didn't break. She completed the story. Because Cleopatra's final act wasn't escape. It was authorship. A final refusal to be written by someone else's hand. In her death, she preserved something sacred, control. The one thing Rome, for all its might, could never take from her. And that, more than anything, is why her ghost lingers. Not in the tombs they cannot find, not in the statues they shattered, but in every woman who refuses to shrink, who leads not in spite of her femininity, but through it. In every ruler who knows the world will not give them power, and so learns to take it without ever raising their voice. Cleopatra was not the end of Egypt. She was its final prophecy, that kingdoms do not die with their walls, they die when they are forgotten. And she did not let Egypt be forgotten. She made it unforgettable, and for that she paid the price. But history, real history, is not a tomb. It is a mirror, and when we look into it, we do not see the past. We see ourselves. We see the fear in Caesar's eyes when she stepped from that carpet. We see the tremble in Antony's hand as he watched her speak. We see Octavian's silence when he found her lifeless body. And we see the question she left behind, still unanswered, still dangerous. What happens when a woman refuses to play the role written for her? Cleopatra answered that question. Not with words, not with war, but with her life. And then, with her death. There is a moment deep in the folds of every civilization when it glimpses itself in the figure of a single person, when all its tensions, contradictions, longings, and fears are reflected back like a cruel, beautiful mirror. Cleopatra was that mirror, not just for Rome, not just for Egypt, but for us. Because she was not merely a queen, she was an idea. And ideas, unlike bodies, don't die. They fracture, they multiply, they hide behind faces and titles and myths, and then they return, reassembled, reshaped, but always familiar. So what did Cleopatra reflect? A woman born into a crumbling empire, surrounded by men who confused power with permanence, trapped between the ancient and the emerging, between sand and marble, between gods and soldiers. She was born into contradiction, and she became its embodiment. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, but ruled in the tongue of Greece. She descended from divine blood, but had to barter and beg and seduce like a mortal. She was royal, but she bled. She was sacred, but she schemed. In her, the world saw the truth it could not face. That power does not belong to those who claim it, but to those who perform it best. And Cleopatra was performance perfected. Every robe, every gesture, every silence, every glance was crafted like an offering to an audience she could never trust, but always controlled. That was her gift. She turned survival into theater, seduction into diplomacy, intellect into performance. Even her death was staged meticulously. A queen dressed for eternity, resting beside loyal maidens, leaving behind not just a corpse, but a symbol. But let's be honest. Most don't want Cleopatra to be intelligent. They don't want her to be strategic. They don't want her to be brave. They want her to be beautiful, passive, tragic, reduced to the woman who loved too much. Because that's easier, more comfortable, safer. If she was only beautiful, then her rise was luck. If she was only emotional, then her fall was inevitable. But Cleopatra defies safety. She stares back through the centuries and forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that she was not lucky. She was lethal, and she didn't fall. She chose the moment to leave, and that choice is what unsettles us the most. Because how do you process a woman who controlled the most powerful men of her time, and then, when she could no longer control the narrative, refuse to let the victors write the ending? That's not just power, that's defiance. That's revolution. And still, we try to put her in boxes. She was a lover. She was a traitor. She was a goddess. She was a harlot. She was a mother. She was a monster. But what if she was simply this? A woman who refused to live on someone else's terms. That question burns through every version of her story. It's why she appears in marble in Rome, in verse in Shakespeare, and Technicolor in Hollywood. We keep returning to her because we've never really understood her. We reduce her because we can't absorb her. She was too much. She is too much. And that, perhaps, is the final crime of Cleopatra. She existed beyond comprehension. Even now, we debate her skin color, her facial features, her bloodline, as if history can be reduced to pigment and bone, as if the most fascinating thing about her was the curve of her nose. But Cleopatra's power was never her face. It was her presence. Her ability to make men see what she wanted them to see, while always hiding something just beyond their reach. She was not the mask. She was the space behind it, and no historian, no artist, no emperor has ever reached her. Not truly. We still search for her tomb, the last missing piece, as if stone and earth could finally give us closure, but Cleopatra does not want to be found, because Cleopatra never wanted to be owned. She lived in a world where every woman of power was eventually claimed by men, through alliance, through conquest, through memory. She escaped all three, even in death. Octavian thought he won. He marched through Rome, unchallenged, crowned not by gods but by absence. He built an empire, but Cleopatra built something more dangerous. A myth immune to empire. A presence that whispered in art, in rebellion, in every woman who would one day walk into a room and dare to lead. Because that's the legacy she left us. Not a crown, but a question. What does it cost to be unforgettable? For Cleopatra, the cost was everything. Her kingdom, her lover, her life. She wagered it all against the machine of history and lost the war, but not the memory. That's the paradox. She died surrounded by the failure of her plans, and yet she outlived every one of her enemies, not in years, but in echo. Caesar is a monument. Antony is a footnote. Octavian is a name in a textbook. But Cleopatra is a presence, a silence that outlasts the scream, a gaze that never looks away, a story we still can't stop telling, because maybe, deep down, we all want what she had. Not the throne, not the lovers, not the gold, but the courage to decide our own ending. Cleopatra never wrote her own memoir. No parchment survives in her voice, no scroll with her confessions, no monologue in which she explains the choices that brought empires to their knees. And yet, she remains one of the most written about women in all of history. That is the paradox. The woman who mastered language left behind only silence. And we, 2,000 years later, are still trying to fill it. What is it we're looking for in her? Redemption. Proof that she was misunderstood? Confirmation that beauty alone cannot shake the world? Or is it something darker? Some need to dismantle the myth, to pull off the crown, smear the coal, strip away the godhood and say, see? She was just a woman after all. That need speaks more about us than about her, because Cleopatra does not belong to herself anymore. She belongs to every age that needed her to be something. To Augustus, she was a threat. To Plutarch, she was a cautionary tale. To Shakespeare, she was a tragic muse. To Hollywood, she was a spectacle. To feminists, a figure of defiance. To misogynists, a warning. Each time we tell her story, we shape her body, her voice, her choices, into something that serves a purpose. But what if her only purpose was to be, not to serve a narrative, not to fit a category, but to exist in contradiction, simultaneously strong and fragile, divine and doomed, manipulative and sincere? A woman who is allowed to contain multitudes, like every man is. The world has never liked women like that, because Cleopatra wasn't built to be loved. She was built to survive. And survival in her time was not a passive thing. It was a daily performance. Every breath had to be calculated. Every smile, every step, every whisper could be the difference between keeping a throne or being swallowed by the palace floor. When she walked into a room, she wasn't a guest. She was a message. This is why Caesar was drawn to her. Not for softness, but for sharpness. In her he saw not submission, but sovereignty. Not beauty, but brilliance. He did not love her despite her mind. He loved her because of it. Antony, too, was seduced not just by her presence, but by the world she represented. Egypt was everything Rome was not. Sensual, poetic, ancient, unknowable. Cleopatra embodied that contradiction. She wasn't just a lover. She was a civilization wearing perfume. And still, we reduce her. Even now, the most common image of Cleopatra is one of seduction. The gaze, the lips, the coiled serpent. But what if the most dangerous thing she ever did had nothing to do with love? What if her true rebellion wasn't in whom she bedded, but in how she ruled? A woman, fluent in politics, commanding armies, running an economy, negotiating with generals, building libraries, translating treaties. This was her real power. And for that, she had to be erased. Because the world remembers men through their victories, but it remembers women through their defeats. And Cleopatra's final moments, written not by her but by her enemies, became her prison. A queen who chose death rather than humiliation. And yet, somehow, even that became twisted. They called it weakness, vanity, a melodrama. But Cleopatra's suicide was not an escape. It was a rejection. She rejected Octavian's triumph, rejected the leash they wanted to place around her neck, rejected the narrative they had written in advance, the one where she would be dragged through Rome in chains, paraded like loot, a foreign whore led like an animal behind a conquering hero. She refused, and that refusal became her immortality. Because now, every time you hear her name, there's a pause, a flicker, a question. Not just about her, about you. What does it mean to hold power in a world that wants you small? What does it cost to be seen fully and not flinch? What happens when a woman refuses to be anyone's symbol even while becoming one? Cleopatra's legacy isn't buried in a tomb. It's walking beside us, breathing through every woman who dares to take up space, every outsider who enters the halls of power, every person who refuses to wear the mask designed for them. She did not leave behind an empire. She left behind a blueprint for those who come after, for those who are told they are too much, too proud, too sexual, too political, too loud, too intelligent, too complicated. Cleopatra was all of those things, and she made the world remember her anyway. Not because she was perfect, but because she was never afraid to be whole. So let them argue about how she died. Let them guess where her bones lie. Let them rewrite her with every century. None of it matters, because Cleopatra is not history. She is a mirror, and the moment you look into her eyes, through the stone, through the myth, through the layers of propaganda and poetry, you don't just see a queen. You see yourself, and you're left with one question. Will you live on someone else's terms, or will you, like her, dare to choose your own ending?